She was betrayed. My brother stood there in that federal conference room, breaking every rule he'd sworn to follow. He'd bought the company that wrote the test, then tried to pass it himself. 3 months of deception hidden in paperwork he thought no one would read. The arrogance of it made my hands tremble. He actually smiled at the generals, expecting them to shake his hand and sign away millions in taxpayer money. He didn't know I'd already sent the email that would end his career. He didn't know that this time someone was watching. But what happened next would change everything we thought we knew about power, family, and justice. My name is Director Sullivan. I'm 41 years old, and I serve as the Chief Compliance Officer for Defense Acquisitions at the Pentagon. When contractors try to cheat the American people out of billions in defense spending, I'm the one who stops them cold. This morning, I sat in a secure conference room with walls thick enough to block any signal, watching my older brother Daniel work the room like he owned it. Daniel Sullivan, Executive Vice President at Apex Defense Solutions, was putting on quite a show. He'd just finished presenting his company's proposal for Project Sentinel, a new radar system for protecting our bases overseas. The satisfaction on his face told me he thought he'd already won. He hadn't looked at me once during his entire presentation. Not until General Harrison, the man whose word could make or break any defense contract, turned in my direction and said simply, "Sullivan, we need your verdict." That's when Daniel finally noticed me. His expression was the same one I'd seen since childhood. That mixture of surprise and dismissal, as if I was still the little sister who used to iron his shirts before school. He had no idea I held the authority to destroy everything he'd built on lies. 3 hours before this meeting, Daniel had made a comment in the hallway that still burned in my chest. He'd been talking to General Harrison, gesturing broadly with his coffee cup when he noticed me walking past. "Oh, that's just Maggie," he'd said with that practiced executive laugh. "She does the paperwork side of things. Makes sure we dot our I's and cross our T's. Important work, but not exactly rocket science." Then he'd actually patted me on the shoulder, like I was a faithful secretary who'd brought him his messages. General Harrison hadn't smiled. Neither had his aide. But Daniel was too caught up in his own performance to notice the temperature change in the hallway. That dismissive pat, that casual diminishment of my work, it was the culmination of 40 years of being pushed aside. Every family dinner where he interrupted my stories. Every graduation where our parents took more pictures of him in the audience than me on stage. Every promotion I earned that got a brief mention before the conversation turned back to Daniel's latest triumph. For decades, I'd accepted it. I'd learned to find satisfaction in doing excellent work that no one celebrated. But standing in that hallway, watching him reduce my career to paperwork while he violated the very laws I'd sworn to uphold, something inside me crystallized into absolute certainty. This would be the last time Daniel Sullivan looked through me instead of at me. Growing up, Daniel was everything our parents dreamed of in a son. He was handsome in that Kennedy way, all perfect teeth and firm handshakes. At church, the older ladies would stop my mother just to tell her what a fine young man she'd raised. At school events, teachers would pull him aside to discuss his bright future while I stood holding both our backpacks. Our father, a Navy veteran who'd served in Vietnam, saw Daniel as his legacy. When Daniel joined ROTC in college, Dad bought a dozen frames for the photos he knew would come. When I quietly earned my degree in contract law, graduating summa cum laude, Dad mentioned it briefly at Sunday dinner before asking Daniel about his latest military exercise. Our mother was no different. She kept a scrapbook of Daniel's achievements. Every certificate, every newspaper mention, every company newsletter that featured his name. When I passed the bar exam on my first try, she said, "That's nice, dear," and asked if I could help plan Daniel's promotion party. I remember the Christmas I tried to explain my work in procurement oversight. I'd just completed a review that saved the government $40 million by catching fraudulent billing from a major contractor. My mother's eyes glazed over halfway through. "It sounds very complicated," she said, then turned to ask Daniel about his golf game with the senator. The truth was, I stopped expecting recognition by the time I was 25. I'd learned that some children are raised to be stars while others are raised to be reliable. I was reliable. I showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. I handled the details everyone else ignored. When Daniel needed his security clearance paperwork completed, guess who spent her weekend making sure every form was perfect? The irony wasn't lost on me. While he collected accolades for his charm and connections, I was quietly building expertise in the very systems that made his world possible. Every contract he celebrated, every deal he closed, they all had to pass through processes I understood better than he ever would. But understanding and respect are different things. He saw me as part of the furniture of his success story, necessary but unremarkable. What Daniel never grasped was that being invisible had taught me to see everything. Every shortcut he took, every rule he bent, every time he relied on a handshake instead of proper documentation. I watched, I learned, and I remembered. And now, all those years of observation were about to matter more than either of us could have imagined. The facility where I work doesn't appear on public maps. It's a CIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility built to standards that would make most bank vaults look flimsy. No windows, no cell signals, no recording devices except the official ones. The air itself is filtered and monitored. When you're dealing with classified defense contracts worth billions, paranoia isn't a personality flaw, it's a job requirement. My official title is Senior Acquisition Integrity Compliance Director. It's a mouthful that most people outside the Pentagon don't understand. But inside these walls, everyone knows exactly what it means. I'm the person who can stop any contract, no matter how powerful the contractor, no matter how urgent the military says it is, if I find evidence of fraud, corruption, or conflict of interest. Last year, I reviewed a proposal for new encrypted communication systems for special operations. The contractor was a Fortune 500 company with lobbyists on every corner of Capitol Hill. Their presentation was flawless, their technology impressive, their political connections impeccable. But when I examined their subcontractor list, I found a shell company registered in Delaware just 2 weeks before the bidding opened. That shell company was owned by the brother-in-law of the general who'd written the requirements. I killed that contract with a single memorandum. No appeals, no negotiations, no second chances. The general retired quietly 2 months later. The contractor's stock dropped 12%. And somewhere in a special operations unit, soldiers got equipment from an honest supplier instead of a corrupt one. But to my family, I'm still just Maggie who works in government procurement, which they imagine means ordering office supplies and filing reports. They've never asked for details, never shown curiosity about what I actually do. Daniel once introduced me at a party as my sister who does admin work for the military. I didn't correct him. By then, I'd learned that being underestimated was its own form of power. The truth is, my signature has stopped more fraud than most FBI agents will see in their careers. My reviews have protected classified technology from falling into the wrong hands. My decisions have ensured that when American service members go into harm's way, their equipment won't fail because someone cut corners for profit. There's no glory in this work, no medals or press conferences. But there's something deeper, something Daniel would never understand. There's the knowledge that when everyone else is playing games, someone is keeping score. And today I'm about to show him exactly what that means. I'd been examining Apex Defense Solutions' proposal for 6 weeks, going through every page, every attachment, every financial disclosure with the thoroughness of a surgeon. The package was impressive on the surface, exactly what you'd expect from a company run by someone like Daniel. Glossy, professional, with all the right words in all the right places. But something in the financial attachments caught my attention. It was barely a footnote, referenced only once in 800 pages of documentation. 3 months ago, Apex had acquired a small consulting firm called Strategic Defense Analytics. The purchase price was modest, barely worth mentioning in their multi-billion-dollar portfolio. Most reviewers would have skipped right past it, but I recognized that name. Strategic Defense Analytics had been under a government contract 2 years ago. They'd been hired to help develop the technical requirements for Project Sentinel, the exact project Apex was now bidding on. My pulse quickened, but my hands remained steady as I pulled up the Federal Acquisition Database. There it was, clear as day. The same personnel who'd written the requirements were now on Apex's payroll. They'd literally bought the people who designed the test, then submitted a proposal to pass that same test. It was like a student buying the teacher before the final exam. This wasn't just unethical, it was a flagrant violation of federal law. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 9.5, specifically prohibits organizational conflicts of interest. The rule exists to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation, and Daniel had either ignored it or thought he could hide it well enough that no one would notice. I documented everything meticulously. The acquisition date, the personnel overlap, the timeline that showed Strategic Defense Analytics finishing their government contract and immediately being absorbed by Apex. I pulled emails, contracts, SEC filings, creating an evidence file that would hold up in any court or congressional hearing. Then I composed my finding. Not a recommendation, not a suggestion, but a formal determination. In the language of federal contracting, I was exercising my full authority to reject the proposal based on clear regulatory violations. There would be no warning. No opportunity to revise and resubmit, no back-channel negotiations. The violation was too severe, too deliberate. I sent my determination to General Harrison with a classification marking that would ensure it went straight to him, bypassing the usual chain of command. The subject line was simple: Apex proposal, immediate disqualification required. His response came back in 12 minutes. Understood. I'll give you the floor when ready. We'll have security standing by. I leaned back in my chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't satisfaction or revenge. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of standing up straight after a lifetime of being pushed down. Daniel thought he could buy his way past the rules, charm his way through the gates, treat the law like a suggestion and his sister like a footnote. He was about to learn that in my world, the facts don't care about your charm. The regulations don't bend for your connections. And the sister you've ignored your entire life is the one person you should never have underestimated. The conference room felt smaller when I entered, despite its impressive size. The walls were lined with monitors showing classification warnings. The table was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the overhead lights like a dark pool. Around it sat 15 people who controlled billions in defense spending, their faces carefully neutral, their folders closed. Daniel was at the far end with his team. 4 men in identical navy suits who looked like they'd been pressed from the same corporate mold. He was laughing at something one of them had said, that easy laugh that had opened so many doors for him over the years. He glanced up when I entered, and for just a moment his smile flickered. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. Some primitive part of his brain recognized that something was different. I took my seat at the side of the table, in the position designated for the integrity officer. It looked like an observer's chair, off to the side, easy to ignore. Daniel's smile returned, fuller now, dismissive. He turned back to his team, shuffling his presentation materials with practiced confidence. General Harrison called the meeting to order with military precision. Daniel stood immediately, buttoning his jacket with one smooth motion, his presenter's smile switching on like a spotlight. For 45 minutes, he painted a picture of technological superiority, of American innovation, of his company's unique ability to deliver what the military needed. He used every trick he'd learned at business school, every psychological trigger, every rhetorical device. The room listened in silence. A few of the younger officers took notes. The senior ones sat still as stones, giving nothing away. Daniel's voice grew more confident with each slide, each perfectly crafted argument. He was performing for an audience he thought he owned. When he finished, he looked around the room with that expectant pause of a man waiting for applause. His team nodded along, playing their supporting roles. One of them actually started to clap before catching himself. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. General Harrison turned to me with deliberate slowness. "Director Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We need your compliance assessment." I stood slowly, my movements precise and unhurried. When I spoke, my voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. "General Harrison, distinguished board members, I've completed my review of the Apex Defense Solutions proposal for Project Sentinel." I paused, letting the formality of the moment settle over the room like fog. This proposal represents a fundamental violation of federal acquisition law. Apex Defense Solutions purchased Strategic Defense Analytics 3 months ago, acquiring the very team that wrote the technical requirements for this project under government contract. This is a textbook organizational conflict of interest as defined in FR Part 9.5. Daniel's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, then the beginning of anger. He started to speak, but I continued, my voice cutting through whatever protest he was forming. This isn't a technical error that can be corrected. This isn't a misunderstanding that can be clarified. This is a deliberate attempt to circumvent the competitive bidding process by purchasing insider knowledge. The evidence is documented, verified, and unambiguous. I turned to face Daniel directly for the first time. Mr. Sullivan, your company acquired the architects of this project's requirements, then bid on those same requirements as if you'd developed your solution independently. You knew exactly what the government was looking for because you bought the people who decided what to look for. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. One of his team members started to stand, starting to object, but General Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. You will remain seated and silent, I continued, each word deliberate and final. Under my authority as Senior Acquisition Integrity Compliance Director, I am formally rejecting this proposal. Apex Defense Solutions is disqualified from this and any related contracts for a minimum of 3 years. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Inspector General for Criminal Investigation. The blood drained from Daniel's face. 3 years of disqualification meant death for a defense contractor. The criminal investigation meant possible jail time. His empire, built on connections and charm, was crumbling in real time. This determination is final and non-appealable, I said. General Harrison, I recommend immediate termination of this meeting and revocation of all facility access for Apex personnel. General Harrison stood, his presence filling the room. Security, he called, and 2 uniformed officers entered immediately. They'd been waiting just outside, already briefed on what might happen. Mr. Sullivan, the general said, looking at Daniel with undisguised contempt, you and your team will surrender your badges and be escorted from the facility immediately. Any attempt to contact board members regarding this matter will be considered witness tampering. Daniel finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak croak. Maggie, you can't. This is we're family. I looked at him with the detachment of a professional doing her job. In this room, Mr. Sullivan, I am Director Sullivan. And family doesn't exempt you from federal law. The security officers moved forward, positioning themselves behind Daniel's team. One of them stumbled, standing up, papers scattering across the polished table. Daniel remained frozen, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time in his life. As they were escorted out, General Harrison addressed the room. Let this be clear to everyone present. We don't tolerate corruption, regardless of who you are or who you know. Director Sullivan has done exactly what we expect from our integrity officers. She held the line. The other board members began to stand, several nodding in my direction. Not the dismissive nods of acknowledgement I'd known my whole life, but something different. Respect, recognition, the understanding that I'd just done something most people wouldn't have the courage to do. When the room emptied, I remained standing by the table, my hands flat against its cool surface. I'd spent so many years believing I needed their approval, their recognition, their validation. But in that moment, I realized I'd never needed any of it. I'd already had everything that mattered: competence, integrity, and the courage to use both when it counted. The call from my mother came that evening, just as I knew it would. I was in my home office, reviewing documents for another case, when her ringtone filled the quiet room. I let it ring 3 times before answering, already knowing what I'd hear. Margaret, what have you done? Her voice was shrill, accusatory, as if I'd committed some unforgivable crime. Daniel called us in tears. Actual tears. He says you destroyed his company, that you humiliated him in front of everyone. How could you do this to your own brother? I stayed silent, letting her wind herself up. She continued without pause. He's saying he might face criminal charges. Criminal charges, Margaret. Your father is beside himself. We don't understand how you could be so cruel. Daniel has worked his entire life for this success. And you destroyed it in one meeting, over some technical paperwork issue? It wasn't a technical issue, Mom, I said quietly. He broke federal law. He tried to defraud the government. Oh, please, she said, dismissive as always. Everyone bends the rules in business. That's how things work. You've always been too rigid, too focused on unimportant details. Your brother understands the big picture. The big picture is that he committed a felony. Don't be dramatic. Surely you can fix this. Call someone, explain it was a misunderstanding. You have that position now, you must have influence. Use it to help your family for once, instead of hiding behind rules and regulations. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one I'd carried since childhood. The sensation of being unseen, unheard, reduced to a supporting role in someone else's story. But this time, it didn't make me shrink. It made me clear. Mom, I need you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once. Daniel broke the law. He did it knowingly, deliberately, and with full awareness of the consequences if he got caught. I did my job. I protected taxpayer money and military integrity from someone who thought he was above the rules. But he's your brother, and I'm your daughter. When has that ever mattered? The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. I don't know what's happened to you, Margaret. This isn't how we raised you. No, I agreed. It isn't. You raised me to be invisible, to support Daniel's success, to never claim space of my own. But I raised myself to be something more. And if you can't see that, then that's your limitation, not mine. You're going to regret this, she said. When you're alone with your rules and regulations, when you have no family left, you'll regret choosing your job over your brother. I didn't choose my job over my brother, Mom. I chose integrity over corruption. The fact that you can't tell the difference says everything about why we're having this conversation. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down gently and went back to my work. There would be no more calls from them, I knew. No more obligatory holiday dinners where I sat quietly while Daniel held court. No more family photos where I stood slightly apart, positioned like an afterthought. But sitting in my office, surrounded by the work that mattered, I felt lighter than I had in years. They'd cut me off thinking it was a punishment. They didn't realize it was a gift. Freedom from seeking approval that would never come. Freedom from pretending their values were mine. Freedom to be exactly who I'd already become without apology or explanation. 8 months later, I stood at the podium in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, a room usually reserved for medal ceremonies and the highest military honors. The Secretary of Defense had just finished speaking about integrity, about the courage it takes to stand against corruption, especially when it's personal. I'd been promoted to Deputy Director of Acquisition Integrity for the entire Department of Defense. My team had grown from 15 people to over 200. We'd implemented new screening procedures that had already caught 17 cases of contractor fraud, saving taxpayers nearly $1 billion. The audience was filled with generals, admirals, senior civilians, and congressional staff. But the faces I focused on were my team members, the people who did the unglamorous work of reading every line, checking every number, holding every contractor accountable. They were applauding not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because they knew what this moment meant. Integrity, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, isn't about being perfect. It's about being consistent. It's about holding the line even when that line runs through your own life. It's about understanding that our obligations to the law, to the taxpayers, to the service members who depend on our decisions, these obligations supersede any personal loyalty. I thought about Daniel as I spoke. Last I'd heard, he'd left the defense industry entirely. His reputation too damaged to recover. His company had folded after the criminal investigation became public. He'd moved to another state, started over in commercial real estate. Our parents had moved to be closer to him, still believing he was the victim of an unjust system. Every contract we review, every decision we make carries weight beyond dollars and cents. We're guardians of trust. When we do our jobs correctly, no one notices. When we fail, people die. That's the reality we accept when we take this oath. The applause that followed was different from anything Daniel had ever received. It wasn't charm or personality or connections that earned it. It was respect for doing the hardest thing, choosing principle over preference, law over loyalty, integrity over ease. After the ceremony, General Harrison found me in the crowd. He'd been promoted too, partly because of how he'd handled the Apex situation. "Director Sullivan," he said, "I need to tell you something. That day in the conference room, when your brother tried to diminish your work, I wanted to correct him. But I realized you didn't need me to defend you. You were going to show him exactly who you were when it mattered most. Thank you, General." "No," he said firmly. "Thank you. You reminded all of us what courage actually looks like. It's not the big gestures or the public stands. It's reading every footnote, catching every violation, and having the spine to act on what you find, no matter who's across the table." That evening, I returned to my office, now larger with windows overlooking the Potomac. My new nameplate read Deputy Director Sullivan. But titles had never been what mattered to me. What mattered was the work, the mission, the knowledge that somewhere a soldier would come home because their equipment didn't fail, because a contractor didn't cut corners, because someone was watching. I thought about the little girl who used to hold her mother's purse at Daniel's ceremonies, who learned to find satisfaction in being helpful rather than celebrated. She'd grown into someone who didn't need the spotlight because she'd found something better purpose. The phone on my desk rang. Another case, another contract, another decision that would ripple through the defense industry. I answered it with the same steady voice I'd cultivated over decades of being underestimated. Director Sullivan, how can I help you? Because that's what I do. I help. I protect. I hold the line. Not for recognition or applause, but because someone has to. And I've learned that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone forgot to notice. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked or underestimated, remember this. Your strength isn't measured in volume or visibility. It's measured in the moments when you stand firm in your truth, even when standing alone. It's in the quiet work that keeps the world turning, the unglamorous decisions that prevent disasters no one will ever know about. They may not see you now. They may never truly see you, but that doesn't diminish your worth or your impact. Because real power isn't about being noticed. It's about being necessary. And when the moment comes when everything hangs in the balance, you'll be ready. Not because you practiced being loud, but because you mastered being right. That's the gift of being underestimated. They never see you coming until it's too late to stop you.